how was the interview? Good? I haven't had a chance to see it yet.
Bart really had Joe thinking seriously again. Because what Joe did was he pulled up the Apollo flag and they were saying, well, everybody says it's waving. And then Bart says, oh, wait a minute. Let's pull up the Apollo 15 flag because the astronauts walking by it and the flag's waving and nobody touched it. All he did was walk by it. And a lot of people were always harping on the astronauts, but they still had their hand on the pole. And Mythbusters pulled the same thing. But this is the first time that Bart showed Joe that Apollo 15 footage. And what he did was Bart put together a little package that all they had to do was the producer just had to roll it and stop it at certain points. And he also showed in the window how the astronauts had the camera 10 feet back on that craft. And you could see them actually putting something up on that window. And it kind of goes like this and it rotates, then it comes back. And then all of a sudden, you could see the work light above. And then all of a sudden, it opens up and there's the Earth. Big, huge blue, and there's nothing there except all this blue. Yeah. So then Joe was saying, well, I don't know about that. It could be that they put the camera in the back because of the lighting, and the Earth would have been huge halfway to the moon because it's 3/4 the size if you knock a quarter off, of the moon, but 4 moons will fit into the Earth. So what he was saying was that if they're halfway to the moon, like Armstrong said, that Earth would be massive in the window. So the best thing to do the trick shot to make it look like it was in space was to put the camera at the back. Now, Joe agreed with him on that and many other points. But Joe wouldn't actually answer Bart's question. Do you believe those moon landings were fake? Well, I'll tell you, Bart, I'll tell you near the end of the interview whether I think so or not. Yeah, it was really something to watch, but he did a really good job on that.
But what's interesting, though, with Joe Rogan is that I remember watching him 10 years ago, and he was openly questioning the Apollo moon missions. And he had on a scientist at that time. He was debating a scientist. They're going back and forth. And it was good because it wasn't so much that Joe Rogan was technical in his response to this scientist. And I wish I could remember his name. But what was very interesting about the debate is that the scientist was giving all these explanations as to why NASA didn't do this and how they lost the telemetry tapes and so on and so on. And Rogan's response back was perfect. He says, we're talking about NASA, high IQ. How can they lose 14,000 telemetry tapes? We're talking about NASA. And the scientist was just completely stunned. Like he didn't know how to respond. It was very, very revealing. But then after that, Joe Rogan went dark. He refused to talk about the Apollo missions. I remember there was one radio show he was doing after that. And his co-host actually kind of said to him right on the air, he said, well, you're no longer talking about it anymore. What's going on here? And he just went quiet for years on it. And you have to wonder if he got his marching orders.
Well, you know what happened at the end of the show? Joe said that he was kind of treading on thin water there because what had happened was he says, oh boy, when this show goes out, people are going to be calling in and they're going to be mad. They're going to really, really be giving me a bad time. So I was wondering if you would mind coming back on the show again, and if I could bring on someone who wants to debate you on the show live, then that way it will even things out and stop the bad publicity that I know I'm going to be receiving. So Bart, of course, he says, yep. He says, yeah. He says, I don't have a problem with that at all.
Tell me, Robert, did Joe Rogan explain why he invited Bart on?
No.
He's backed off the whole Apollo thing over the last 2 or 3 years. Yeah. And I suspect he was got at by probably Penn Jillette, Penn and Teller. It could be because he's been on the show, and it may be that he had a go at Joe Rogan for it. And then Joe's probably seen what happened to that American football player, Stephen Curran, I think he was.
Oh, yeah, that's right, too. Yeah, they had a really nasty go at him, too, after that.
Yeah, they did. It could be that Joe backed off on the whole Apollo thing
But he was agreeing with a lot of what Bart was saying, especially with Randy. We were talking about the footage missing, all those tapes missing. And Bart says, yes. He says, but the difference between the tapes missing is that they were purposely either missing or re-recorded on. And I thought they would have been speaking more about all of those tapes they found at McDonald's. Well, not tapes, but all the video footage of the orbiting. You know, they were orbiting the moon, and all that footage was found at that McDonald's location, but they never brought that up. I was kind of surprised at that. But no, to answer your question, Marcus, no, they said nothing about why he was on there, why Joe interviewed him or any of that. But I know Bart met Joe somewhere else years ago, and I don't know if that was the first time he was on here.
Yeah, it could have been. Could have been when he was doing a radio show or something like that. I mean, maybe it's his producer, James. Maybe he suggested it as a subject that could be discussed, because he maybe had seen what Bart Sibrel had done, or maybe he read the article in Nexus that Bart authored and thought, well, let's get into discussing it, because we've got the whole Artemis program being put back and put back. And maybe people have picked up on it. If it was so easy to land a man on the moon 50 years ago, why are they taking so long to get back? Maybe people have been asking these questions, and Joe thought, well, let's open that can of worms again, see what happens.
Well, it could be Destin that's smarter every day. Look at that video he put out going after NASA and the Artemis, but Elon Musk, going after Starship. Well, first it was going to take 7 rockets, now it's going to take 15. Then with Thunderfoot, Phil Mason had a go at it. He said that it's going to take 20.
Yeah.
So as soon as Destin put this video out, Thunderfoot responded to it, and he made it even worse, showing that, look, you guys are going to need 20 rockets to get there fully because it needs all that fuel. Then Bart brought up a good subject, saying that von Braun said they need 3 of those ships full of fuel just to reach the moon. And where are they going to refuel it? How's it going to get refueled? Why do they need a gateway station? Why do they need all this refueling systems? Why do they need all this now? And they sent one single Saturn V with a payload in it, including the LEM and its fuel supply. Why and how did they get that to the moon? And not only that, but they got it back. No refueling's required. And yet, look at how small the fuel tanks were. Have you seen the one that they're going to be sending with Artemis? That lander? Those tanks are massive. I just showed them in the last video. And there's 8 of them. Yeah. So that's ridiculous amount of fuel that these guys are burning up. All for one extra man, because there's 3 persons in that new lander. Yeah. So they're going to need all this extra fuel for what? 180, 70 pounds? An extra 170 pounds? See, none of this is adding up. This is the type of thing that Destin and Thunderfoot were also going over. Yeah. And they were also talking about not only refueling, but how are they going to dock and then get those fuel valves locked on? We're not talking about going to the ISS and refueling some fuel tank on the ISS. That's already been launched and stabilized in Earth's orbit. Now we're going to be sending 2 separate vehicles. One's going up there. It'll be waiting to be refueled while the tanker comes up. So now you have 2 separate entities here. And then not only that, but then they're also going on about Artemis. Oh, that's right. That's the other space program that is being run. So now we have Starship and we have Artemis 3. Which one's going to get there first? You tell me.
Yeah, if Starship gets there, I mean, this thing's what, 50, 60 foot high? And it's supposed to land so that it's got its feet on the ground. It's so tall. Now, if that thing hits a rock, it's going to fall over. And if it falls over, end of story, dead astronauts. So how come that is such a good idea? Just because Musk says it is, doesn't mean that it is a good idea. You've got to have something which is spread it out. So you've got maybe a shortish ship, but wide legs, like the lunar lander.
That's the plan. There's another factor in that, Marcus, what you just mentioned with, that 50-foot lander. Unlike the lunar module, they can't see. They have no visual field. So this brought up something else that I'm probably going to write in a future book, but it's not in my first 3 books. But something occurred to me recently about another aspect of the Apollo landing is that And again, official narrative speak here. When they were landing, when they were descending from 50,000 feet, they were actually using, again, according to the official version, visual cues to see where they were. Initially, the lunar lander was facing down so the astronauts can see the lunar surface. So they were using visual cues to guide the ship. And then as it got closer, then it turned around on its back and then it positioned itself for the landing. And then the rest is history. But still, no matter what way you look on this, they're still landing blind. I mean, they're landing in unfamiliar territory, number one. They've never done this, number two. They've done it with unmanned missions, but they've never done it with manned missions. And back then, they had the technology to duplicate what we have here in aviation. They could have put in a very simplistic form of a landing system. When you're landing a plane on instruments here, any plane, whether it's a small plane or a large plane, they use what is called the instrument landing system. So that involves not only equipment on the plane, but that involves equipment on the ground at the airport. And they both work in tandem to guide that plane in. And it keeps it on a glide path, the proper glide path and a glide slope for an ILS landing. So that's like, you know, when you have visibility, it's like about a mile or several hundred feet type of thing. So they could have done the same thing with the Apollo missions. What they could have done is they could have sent up unmanned missions, several of them, to carry equipment to put on the moon in the designated area that the Apollo lunar lander was supposed to land. And then they could have used that simple form of landing system on the lunar surface to guide the lunar module down. So you would have equipment in the lunar module as well as equipment on the lunar surface guiding it down, kind of like a glide scope, just like you see with airliners when they're making a landing at the airport. They're always using ILS approaches, right? It just hit me that the absolute insanity of selling the narrative that we're going to land a manned mission on the moon without any equipment on the lunar surface to guide that lunar module to the surface.
There's a problem with that because what would happen is they had a contingency plan. I think in your book there were 3 or 4 different landing sites that were designated in case they couldn't make it to that one spot. So let's say that happened. Well, okay, let's say they put a LORAN or a VOR station or whatever they are, poppy lights or whatever you want to call it. Let's say they brought them up there the first time, put them here. Well, what happens if they don't land there? Because Neil Armstrong had to take over the lander because it was going to land on boulders. So they had to move it. Now, if they would have put all that equipment up there the first time, it would have been of no use. So they would have been going in blind for the second time. Now, I believe the new one, the new lander, has cameras on the outside so that they can watch the monitors and see where they're landing, where they didn't have that the first time. But then again, look at what happened with Artemis. Well, they had 24 cameras. Well, where are they?
Yeah.
We only saw video through 2 cameras during that entire mission. So what happened to the other 22 cameras? But the whole point is, they're going to need some kind of landing system if they don't have cameras positioned on the outside.
That's the thing. And to your point, just to back up a second, to your point, they could have duplicated that landing system in 2 or 3 other backup sites. My point is that they didn't even build that into the narrative. I mean, they forgot that aspect of it. And now you can take a chance and land an unmanned mission on the moon, and many have been severely damaged by doing that. But to take a chance doing that with a manned mission, it goes against every safety rule you can think of. They could have put a very, very crude or simplistic landing system on the moon. They had the technology to do it, and they didn't do that. They didn't even work that into the narrative to try to sell it. And that's really what made me think. And when Marcus was talking about this new lander, I mean, they're coming in, they can't see. They need some kind of landing system on the lunar surface in order to guide that ship down. I mean, that's the narrative they're going to go with, and they have to complete the narrative.
Space Odyssey 2001 nailed it right to the T. It was like a VOR system. Remember, it had the 2 needles that moved up and down, going for instrument rating. I mean, that's what you do. The old planes, the old Cessnas, right? You keep those needles crossed. Every dot was 2 degrees off. And the guys in Space Odyssey 2001 nailed that right on the button when they had it landing, when that ship was landing down. And you could see it drift.
Yeah. Isn't that interesting? Because in the movie, that's great. Yeah, in the movie, they actually depicted that whole landing system. Yeah. And you don't have that with the Apollo program. I mean, it's just another example of how NASA really forgot to dot the I's and cross the T's here. I mean, it's just, as I said in another interview, it's like a Monty Python skit. It just keeps getting better with time, right?
Dead
Yes.
parrot sketch. It is deceased. It is dead.
Also, they would have to factor in propellant.
Yeah, of course they would.
Extra propellant. That's a very good point, Marcus, because no matter where you are, you always have to have an alternate. When it comes to manned missions, I don't care if it's here or in space, you have to have an alternate. You have to have a backup plan, a contingency. They had nothing. When you were talking earlier about Wernher von Braun, I think he described 3 rockets just with fuel, each one the size of the Empire State Building. That's getting close to what we're really talking about in terms of the reality of getting a manned mission to the moon. It was one of the point I want to raise. The proponents, when they're talking in terms of the Apollo missions, that when they only had a few years to build the technology, and it was brand new technology, and this technology had to be developed, designed, and so on, right? We're not talking that circumstance anymore when it comes to Artemis.
Yeah.
We're talking about 50, 60 years of technology that exists now, that they're still using. And when it comes to, I believe it's the Artemis, it's using the same technology the space shuttle is using. I think they're using the same engines. And why are they having so many problems? And that's the question, right? And I just asked that rhetorically, but that's basically it. Why are they having so many problems and so many delays? And I mean, it's highlighting now more than ever what we've been talking about, that you say they went 50 years ago, but they still haven't been able to get back. And now it's as plain as ever. Artemis is really revealing the reality of what it takes to put one mission on the moon. We're not talking 6 missions or 9 missions in total, I think it was back then, but 6 on the moon. We're talking just one mission, and we're talking, let's say, 10% of the cost if you want to compare it to the Apollo missions. So they was equivalent of about $300 billion to put supposedly 6 manned missions on the moon. We're only talking 1, so let's just take an arbitrary figure and take 10% of that 300 million. That's 30 billion. What is the problem?
You know, Randy, what Bart and Joe were talking about was along the same lines, because all they can do now is send a dummy to the moon.
Helga and Zohar.
So Bart was saying that, let's take a look at this logically. To go to low Earth orbit, that's 1,000 times less than it is to go to the moon. And yet, they supposedly sent men there. Well, if you include Apollo 13, that's 7 missions. So what happened was, now Bart's saying, okay, well, they sent 7 missions and all 7 of them actually did go around the moon, which means they left to the vicinity of the Van Allen belts. We can't even get through the Van Allen belts today, not with humans. It hasn't been done yet. And they also mentioned that the closest one was that space shuttle when they repaired Hubble. Now, that was the furthest that the shuttle ever went. But yet, Bart says, look today. Technology is advanced to so much that we can only send dummies around the moon now.
That's great. Yeah.
Yes, it's such a way of putting it. I mean, and he's so right. And we actually went 9 times, the official version. We actually supposedly went 9 times, like with Apollo 8 and then Apollo 10. The Van Allen belt seems to be a real touchy subject when it comes to the proponents, because they will not accept that not only are we talking about intense radiation, not only are we talking about radiation that could probably kill an astronaut in seconds if he had no protection, and we're not even factoring into protection, but we're talking about the fact that it's constantly changing. I got ridiculed from one of the online shills on my video saying, oh, is it in flux? Well, yeah, it is in flux. It's constantly in flux. And it's constantly being bombarded by solar flares, coronal mass ejections, any type of solar activity. And so you would need real-time data if you're going to send a mission through that region of space. I mean, realistically speaking, you would need real-time data. In other words, just before launch, okay, you have a window of opportunity, right? If you have the proper shielding. But then again, you couldn't have the proper shielding unless you built a space station in space, because the shielding you would need to get through the Van Allen belts, you wouldn't be able to launch. It'd be too heavy. You know, water and lead, 2 good examples. And this, again, is an arbitrary statement, but you'd be talking about a rocket twice the size of the Empire State Building if you had the real shielding you needed to get through the Van Allen belts.
That's a good point. But then maybe what has happened, remember the Helga and Zohar dummies that were sent out on the Artemis 1 mission, presumably to yet again test the radiation levels. Maybe that came back with readings so high that they knew that humans would not be able to survive it without additional protection. Now, NASA cannot possibly announce that, because the first question anybody will ask is, well, what happened on Apollo? So they're caught. It's checkmate. They're completely stuffed by their own hubris in promoting Apollo. And now they can't repeat it 50 years after it allegedly happened. Now, if those readings were so high that it would be obvious to anybody looking at the readings that humans would not be able to survive it, that is, in my view, the reason for the delays that are going on, because they have to come up with some sort of protection, because the astronauts themselves will almost certainly be asking that. What protection are you going to offer us? You know, you've got these readings, the radiation levels are pretty high. It's not just the Van Allen belts, it's everything beyond it, because the Van Allen belts only protect Earth. They don't protect the moon. There aren't Van Allen belts around the moon. So once you've got past the Van Allen belts, that's when the real danger starts. Now, these Apollo proponents, all right, claim that they skirted around the edge of the belts. Well, that's the Robert Browning fake idea. Of course, you can skirt around it, but you've got to launch in the direction of the skirt. You can't turn left halfway round on your orbit. You can't turn left and go over the poles. That's not how rockets work. Rockets go where they're pointed. You can launch a polar orbit quite easily. You do it from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California. If the rocket falls out, there's nothing it's going to hit. It'll just launch another one. And that's where spy satellites go. They circle around the Earth on a polar orbit. The Earth rotates underneath the orbit, and you can photograph whatever you like. But you can't just launch from Florida, turn left, and go over the poles. That's not the way rockets work. So anybody who claims that that is what happens doesn't know what they're talking about.
Now, this was another thing that Bart brought up in that interview with Joe. There's a problem that Bart was saying because, and Scott had said this too before, that when cosmic radiation, or CMEs, whatever you want to call it, when it bombards the Van Allen belts, they get reactive and they deflect all of that radiation around to the backside of the Earth. So what Bart was saying was he was saying that now all the radiation that is encircling the Earth will eventually come up and around to the top and the bottom, and that's the most concentrated point. So if they claim that they're going through the poles, they're going through the most concentrated point of radiation if they are not dead center, like going through the center of a tornado. If you hit the walls of the tornado, you're gone. But if you were to go right up through the eye of it, it would be smooth sailing right up through the top. That's what they would have to do. So can you imagine having instrumentation trying to go right up through the center of all that magnetic radiation or all that plasma radiation, whatever you want to call it? How are the sensors going to function when they try to send up in the 50s and the sensors overloaded? In the very first rocket they sent up into the belts, the sensor overloaded. So imagine trying to navigate that going up through the center of a tornado that has a magnetic field swirling all around it, radiation. It's going to keep burning the sensors out. So how would you ever figure out how to go through it? If you touch the walls, you're dead. This is just the same like going up through a tornado. So, here's another point that they brought out. Explain that one, you NASA numpties.
Yeah, come on, guys. Let's hear your excuse this time.
They would also have to go up 40, 50,000 miles directly in the center. They would have to go to make sure that they clear the Van Allen belts, and quite an expenditure of propellant.
But of course, that raises another problem, because if you go through the center of the poles, that's the idea. You go through the poles to avoid the radiation around Earth. That's the Van Allen belts. But of course, once you go through the poles, but that's not on the way to the moon. The moon is basically level with the Earth. And that's why they launch from Florida, go over Africa, around India, and so on round. The TLI, this is the official narrative, translunar injection, was basically when they were doing an Earth orbit. And they were more or less level with the equator. I call it an equatorial orbit. If you go through the poles, you're not heading to the moon, you're heading into deep space. Rockets do not steer like cars do. That's why there isn't a steering wheel on board. There's no brakes either. Rockets go where they're pointed.
I thought this was really interesting. I think it was Scott who said this. Here it is where Destin from Smarter Every Day is talking about this refueling. So what ends up happening is you have all these ships. They have to keep sending up fuel to refuel this ship so that it can reach the moon and back. Well, why don't they do it this way then? They have all these fuel tankers that they're going to be sending up there. Well, why don't they slow the rocket down first? So if you're going to send 10 fuel tankers up there to refuel the rocket, then why don't you have the rocket, when it comes from the moon back to the Earth, go into orbit, into Earth's orbit, and then refuel it, and then turn the rocket in the opposite direction and fire the engines till you're down from 26,000 to 1,000 miles an hour, and then just literally fall right into the Earth. You need no heat shield then.
Yeah.
No heat shield required.
Exactly.
So why not do it that way? It's safer. There's no chance of burning up, no heat shield required, nothing.
But also, why do you need all this fuel? What are they going to use the fuel for? They only have to get off the lunar surface and accelerate up to, 6,000 miles an hour to catch up with the orbiting command module on Apollo. With Artemis, they've got this ridiculous halo orbit thing, so they can communicate with Earth, so they're not blocked off by the moon. They only have to have enough fuel to get out of lunar orbit. You get to the neutral point, which is where the gravitational attraction of the Earth and the gravitational attraction of the moon equalize. And then once you're past that, on the way back to Earth, you're accelerated by the Earth's gravity. You don't need fuel. It'll do it by itself. You have to use fuel to get off Earth, yes. To get to the point where you reach your escape velocity, 25,000 miles an hour, is escape velocity from Earth. What's escape velocity from the moon? Let's say it's 1/6 of that. So you only have to get to about 6,000 miles an hour, and then you can get out of the lunar gravity attraction. It's only 20,000 miles you've got to go. And when you're coming from Earth, they don't use fuel. Once they've got escape velocity, they don't use any fuel at all. They just coast all the way to the neutral point.
So then where are these 20 rockets full of fuel coming from? I don't understand that. You see, Destin is saying that they need 15. He shows the document right there. It says 15 starships worth of fuel, 15 starships required to reach the moon. Well, that's the moon and back. He's talking about the full trip. It seems to me like they go up, they reach about halfway. Well, let's say the Kármán line. They need to refuel again. Don't forget, these ships don't even have a payload in them yet that they're testing. And every time they test, I showed on the last video, first test, second test, third test. They lost the 2 in the first test, and a lot of those engines, 7 engines didn't stay lit. And then the
second test,
7 engines went out as well, 2 in the middle and 5 around the outside. They didn't even make it to the Kármán line, and they were already having problems. So how is this going to work if you have a full payload and 7 engines go out? Then what are you going to do? You're not going to make it to low Earth orbit no matter how much fuel you have in there. And by the way, the fuel's finished after you reach the Kármán line. If you were to put a payload on it, you barely even reach it. Now you're out of fuel. I mean, that thing sits there for 5 to 7 seconds before it even goes anywhere. It sits there and it burns half that fuel off before it can even lift off. Or maybe, I don't know, half the fuel, but a quarter of the fuel at least before it even goes anywhere, it gets off that pad. Okay, we all saw what happened with the N1. Blew up 4 times.
The last one, it destroyed the launch pad so badly that America knew what had happened because their spy satellites photographed this destroyed launch pad at Baikonur, which is in Kazakhstan.
Yeah, and then look at Musk. I mean, Elon's very fortunate not to have those things blow up and then scatter all over the place. I mean, the first one blew up, yes. Now we're talking about environmental impact, because every time one of those starships goes into the ocean, you're going to have 32 to 34 engines with fuel that's spewed all over the place falling into the ocean. You're going to have tanks that still have propellant inside of them. Yeah. That's a lot of engines to sit at the bottom of the ocean. So first they say they need 7 ships. Then in the video I showed they need 10 ships. Then Jason comes along and says they need 15. And Thunderfoot comes along and says they need 20. Where are they getting these calculations from? Because they're certainly not showing it in their videos.
They're not. No.
I don't get it. Don't get it. Don't get it. Don't get it. Don't get it.